Walking along a path at the roots of Pikes Peak, you take a fork in the road toward the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a conversation on the arts, faith, and long, hard journeys. In a corner by the fire are three weary travelers. One of those travelers is me, Evangeline and Mark. Welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Here at Believe to See, we explore the relationship between faith, art, and storytelling. Our goal is to help you connect the great story, the great stories, and our stories in order to understand what it means to live with a Christian imagination. We're really going to be delving into that concept of connecting our stories to the great story today, which could be especially hard in seasons of suffering. I'm so excited about our guest today, and I think our conversation is going to be hopeful and life-giving. But before I introduce her, I want to say hi to my co-host, Mandy Hauk.
Hi.
Hi. And I know, Mandy, you have been looking forward to this conversation as much as I have.
Yes, very excited.
So we discovered our guest, I think, independently, and then started posting on Instagram, and so discovered we were both fans, and so we've been, sending each other messages, tagging each other. Did you see KJ's, post today? So without further ado, let's introduce our guest, author and trauma-informed therapist, KJ Ramsey. Welcome from the depths of our heart.
Yes.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me. Totally.
We're so excited. We're, like I said, we're fangirls. So just to kick things off, I'm really drawn to the phrase trauma-informed therapist, and it brings, things to mind for me, connotations to mind, but I would love to hear how that intersects with your writing.
Ooh, yes. Okay. So as a trauma-informed therapist, I respect the role of our body in processing and carrying stress. I have deep respect for the body and for the nervous system's innate ways of regulating, surviving, and thriving. And the ways that intersects with my writing are continuing. They're always unfolding. Like, as my own skill as a writer continues to improve, I find that I have more room to allow this perspective of pacing and honoring the nervous system's needs to really show up in how I structure a book and in getting to write shorter chapters, because people need to take in information in smaller chunks, in when and how I name the reality of abuse in a storyline. And how I use evocative language to help somebody connect to their own sensations and their own emotions while reading about perhaps my own story. All of those things are part of the literary forms that I decide to use. And that's without even getting into the content that I love to be able to share with people. But the way in which I write is I'm always trying to allow how I would pace something and invite someone to be in a session with me, to allow that to be matched with how I write. And that's not always going to be a 1-for-1 match, because there's certain things that are more appropriate in a book than in a therapy session. But it's really fun to get to change how I write in light of what I know and respect of what the body needs.
I love that. I of course first thought of, it would have to do with content and what you're writing. I didn't think about pacing and about, inviting people. But of course that's part of respecting your reader.
Yeah.
is, easing them into the hard stuff. And, I think I've tried to do that before, but I've never really thought about it intentionally. And then also like giving yourself what you need in terms of, pacing in writing a book, which that's one of the hardest things, I think. Like one of the hardest things.
So you mentioned, you touched on your story, and just for listeners who aren't familiar, if you want to share some of that. Because you are definitely obviously more than your journey, but your journey is definitely informative in your work.
Yeah. So some of the things that I have written about in my story are both being disabled, having multiple diseases that I live with, and having had them since I was 20. So it's been about 15 years. And also walking through spiritual abuse and the resulting religious trauma and needing to recover from that. So as a pastor's wife, a pastor who was abused in the church by another pastor and subsequently by the institution around that pastor, it's a large part of what I write about is in response to those stories that I would not have chosen for myself. And that are very, very common. Like the amount of people who deal with chronic illnesses or disability and with being harmed in the church is just astronomical. It's mind blowing. So those are some of the things.
I am really thankful that you were writing on the topics you're writing. Like just this morning, I was reading the Book of Common Courage, which for our listeners, KJ's new book is The Book of Common Courage, Prayers and Poems to Find Strength in Small Moments. And like I came over with the book, to Mandy's house, and I was like, look, she wrote this one for me. This one was for me.
Absolutely.
And, that has happened so many times. But to talk about the Book of Common Courage, just for a little bit, I love this book. It's a prayer book, and it's liturgical, which I love. Do you have a favorite prayer book? Like what inspired you to write this book as a prayer book? In the format that you did.
Yeah. I would say, no, I don't have a favorite prayer book, but yes, I have been inspired by many. I found that the Book of Common Prayer was in some ways a safe place to turn when I lost my own words in the wake of leaving abusive church systems. When I just no longer could pray in the same way, it was very nice to be able to open up and read a collect and just let that stand there for me. So the Book of Common Prayers collects gave me room to pray again when praying became really painful. And then it was also through the BCP that I felt like able to come back to scripture after scripture had been weaponized against me, just like reading only the selections of the Psalms instead of the whole lectionary. And that really informed how I pray too, to just dwell in the Psalms, which so many are full of lament and are very full of rage and honesty of like, I actually do want my enemies to be harmed.
Yes, the imprecatory
prayers are so liberating. But really what most inspired my Book of Common Courage was Padre Gotuma's daily prayer with the Corivilla community. He's one of my favorite poets, and I loved that he has taken the form of the collect and given space to write in language like we actually speak today instead of the more formal language of the Book of Common Prayer. And he does really playful things with language. And I loved even the way that he uses enjambment and line breaks in his prayers rather than in the BCP. It's all written more like a paragraph. I find that there's a lot of room for pausing and for reflecting on meaning when we use line breaks. So yeah, his book really inspired me to take the form of a collect and let it breathe. And then as a trauma therapist, I find the collect to be a really generative space to experience containment, to experience feeling overwhelmed, but allowing yourself to be held. The collect by nature is about gathering up the disparate parts of what we want into a bigger story than the one that we currently can see. And I think that its brevity and focus have a lot of power in giving us a sense of groundedness in the middle of a hard moment. So that's why I chose collects as my own, what I want to have in a prayer book that I wrote.
I'm thinking about the connection between guided prayer and, sort of being guided in a therapy session and being, allowed to be safe. That's one of the things that I found also in liturgical prayer in collects is just practice for when I couldn't pray, just like you were saying, and just a guide through learning again, kind of coming back to it. And so I thought that's really interesting that you bring that up, and that, was part of your motivation. It's really comforting, and that's not something I ever expected. I didn't grow up liturgical. So, that was a surprise. Well, let's talk a little bit about poetry and prayer. I mean, I know you already have, but I love the precision of poetry, of crafting poetry. So I don't know, what does that look like for you? What does writing a poem look like for you? Do you do several versions? Are they usually pretty quick?
Oh man, it really depends on the poem. Some come like a fury, like a train barreling through my mind, and I just have to get it down while I watch the train roll through. I had a poem that I wrote a couple weeks ago like that or it's probably a week ago, on a hike, where the words just came. It felt more like being a conduit. These words I know are arising from conversations I've had recently and things that I'm going through, but they're also words that they're just here, and I'm listening and writing it down. And then of course, I edit everything thoroughly. So there's definitely multiple drafts of poems, and the poems that are in this book, they went through so much editing, but it really depends. Some poems come quickly and are receiving a message from someone else, and some poems are more of a labor and more of I write half of it and scrap most of what I wrote, and then there's only one line that was from the original that makes it to the end. It's really a process of paying attention and getting honest and letting language be as succinct as possible. And a lot of the poems in this book, in the Book of Common Courage, are poetic renderings or reflections on content from the previous book that I wrote, The Lord is My Courage. So there's some poems in there where it wasn't necessarily this came out of nowhere, but where there would be a passage from the previous book where I tried to say it more succinctly. I tried to distill down maybe what was in that chapter down into, 6 stanzas or something. And that was really fun to do too. Different.
So this one, Common Courage, is really based on Psalm 23. Like, I loved even just opening up to the table of contents, and the, section titles basically are just a word or two from Psalm 23. So how did you land on Psalm 23 for this book? Like, what came first, the idea for the book or the pulling it from Psalm 23?
This book was not planned at all. This book was not on my radar as something I was going to do, and I wasn't even yet calling myself a poet. I wasn't calling what I was doing poetry. Really what came first was I was writing The Lord is My Courage, and really before writing it, I had given my publisher like a fake outline of, I knew I was going to write about practicing courage, but I didn't know the form in which I actually wanted it to take. So I kind of gave them like, here's what I'm going to do, quote unquote. And then as I was really getting into like, what is my own, where's the landscape where I've had to practice courage? The landscape of that was spiritual abuse and religious trauma. And so as I reflected on my own story of being harmed by someone who is supposed to be a shepherd, I got deep into the imagery in scripture about shepherding. And really, I came across the way that Jesus feeds the 5,000. And he, in that story, is giving us this juxtaposition between Herod as a shepherd, who is just so ruled by scarcity, cares about people pleasing, and does not care about the least of these. And then Jesus, in the opposite direction of Jerusalem, is gathering this crowd in the wilderness and makes their hunger his responsibility, takes a little boy's loaves and fishes that he offers up in generosity and makes that into more than enough to feed the whole crowd. And that story is actually Jesus directly living out the metaphor of Psalm 23. Even, you'll read in there, like, he had them sit down on the green grass as he makes them lie down in green pastures. It's a direct parallel of Psalm 23. And so I really wanted to play with reflecting on the Psalm in a way that allows us to encounter Jesus as our good shepherd again, even when we have been harmed by people who call themselves shepherds or who are in a shepherding, caregiving role in our lives, whether they're a pastor or a parent or a coach or a teacher or not. So yeah, it happened because I got really playful, and I was thinking through my own story, and then I decided to not just write one book on it, but two, because I was writing poems and prayers as my own way to process the writing of The Lord is My Courage and the sharing of my own story of harm. And those prayers and poems kind of became an actual book, which wasn't the plan.
Yeah.
I love that you make space for the hard stuff, for expressing the pain and the suffering. You were talking earlier about the Psalms being full of, of rage, of lament. That is where I have spent a lot of time in the last couple of years is in Psalms, and just drawing comfort from the honesty and the just the nakedness of suffering.
I love that word, nakedness.
Right. So speaking of Psalms and how you incorporated Psalm 23 into the book of Common Courage, and I just wanted to talk about the lament and the rage that is in Psalms and that I have found comfort in personally. Why do you think, though, that the church is okay with the lament and even that desperation in the Psalms, but not okay with the congregation today voicing those same emotions?
That is a great question. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't actually think most churches give enough space for the actual Psalms of lament, even though they're the majority of the Psalms, or a large portion. I don't know that we actually spend that much time really praying through the Psalms. And the Psalms, of course, are meant to be communally prayed, which is part of what my hope is with the Book of Common Courage, too, in that vein. So I think if I look back at my own life, growing up in the church and spending my whole life going to church, being part of church services, I don't know that the Psalms of Lament were the Psalms that were actually spoken from the front, were actually, drawn from in worship songs. I think praise is much more comfortable in most churches that I've been a part of. So aside from that, I think the church today is in a place of dismissal of, if we were to actually allow people to lament their pain, we would have to see that we need to be part of changing the context in which that pain happens. Mm. And I don't think that a lot of the church wants to own her complicity in being part of systems of oppression and stress.
Amen.
Yep.
Yeah.
Amen.
I've seen that.
Mm-hmm. Tell it like it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Amen, sister.
Yeah. So in your author bio, you have described yourself as a recovering idealist. So I feel like that, unfortunately, I'm sure part of the reason you've had to recover from being an idealist is what we were just talking about.
Yes.
Can you talk about that shift and if there's, I'm assuming, grief involved in that shift of your personality almost? Or am I overstating it to say that?
No, you're not overstating it. And I mean, for me, there's grief involved in every part of what I feel like I am and we are invited into. The growth that we're invited into is actually always through the gate of grief. So I love that you just named grief as part of it. I don't know how people feel about the Enneagram these days, but I'm an Enneagram 4. And
so is Evangeline.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
I'm a 2 and I'm sad I'm not a 4. What kind of artist am I if I'm not a 4? But whatever.
There's amazing artists who are 2s. One of my best friends is a 2, and she is one of the most artistic people I know. Mish.
Okay, thank you. I feel better.
Just saying that. But for so long, my reflexive way of seeing the world is in a lens of lack, of what is missing, rather than what is here. And so as an idealist, that is always seeing what could be. And that means there's constant disappointment because this world and relationships, church, etc., are not what it could be. Brokenness is real. And I don't want to live in a state of perpetual disappointment with my actual life. So as a recovering idealist, I say that as a confession of, I have to train myself to see what is good that's here right now, rather than only what is wrong. And it's about training, it's practicing a different way of seeing, but also practicing a different posture towards my life and towards the past. I'm in a process with writing my next book where I am really trying to look at my own story of from childhood forward, like what was good. So many of us are or have gone through a process of deconstruction, but I think so few of us know what to carry with us forward. Like to be able, I had a wonderful conversation with some friends yesterday. One of whom is deconverted, and she had one of the wisest things to say, and this connects to grief, in that she said, I don't think we can actually be, she was citing this really seminal work for trauma therapists called Complex PTSD by Pete Walker. And in it, he talks, it's this blue book that a lot of us have. And in it, he says something to the effect of like, anger is important, but anger and rage will only get us so far. There are some things, he says this way better than I'm butchering it right now, but there are some things for which you must grieve. There are some pains that must be grieved. And she was pointing out that we actually can't grieve something unless we allow ourselves to feel that part of it was good. The thing that we lost was good.
Oh, wow.
And I can't agree more. I think that something I've said, and I should have probably put it in this book, but didn't, is sadness is the soul's way of saying this mattered. Like our sadness is honoring that something actually did matter to you. So even if there was so much harm, for example, in the church where I was abused and my husband was abused, there also was goodness there. Mm-hmm. And I will bypass the gate of grief, which is the place I must walk through to expand into wholeness and into like the spacious place God has for me. I will bypass that gate if I cannot go back and honor that there was something that was good for me there. And too many of us are stuck in reenacting the binary thinking of our past spirituality in our new place, maybe on a different end of the spiritual continuum or the political continuum, by continuing to look at our past through a lens of black and white, right and wrong, good and bad. And I think that we have to dare to look back and forage really for what was good about that and allow ourselves to dream a little bit about what do I want to take with me through this gate of grief? What comes with me? What is good? So I'm in a process of looking at what's good, even in my own story. Yeah.
I think that's beautiful. The gate of grief, because a gate is not a place where you stop. It's a place where you are, and it's okay to stop. To pause and be there, but it is by definition leading you through to something else. I was thinking as you were talking that the sort of death of idealism is a place where a longing and a desire to see the kingdom coming through sort of grows in the place of wishing that things were perfect and the way that they should be. And there's that, I see it especially in my young adult children, that, burning desire for justice. And this is the way that it should be. And you're like, you are right. Mm-hmm. You are absolutely right. And it's so painful that it isn't. But there's comfort in the fact that it will be made right, is being made right and will be made right, even though, we don't feel that right now in this moment. But I don't know. I think that they're still a little too young to see that. And it's so hard. It's like you don't want this to happen, this process, but at the same time, it's necessary, and it does make that space for longing for the kingdom, I think.
Well, we can't get around the the center point of the Christian story is a cross.
Right.
And that is therefore the center point of all of our stories, that joy and wholeness come strangely through this death.
Mm-hmm. Brokenness.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I can't say that I understand it, but I know that participating in and like consenting to the cross in my life is what makes room for the daily resurrection of the life that I have. And I've lived that path too long to step off of it. It's too true for me to step off of it, that the sorrow of the cross, of my own crosses, of the things that do crush me, the things that do kill, both both actual like cells in my body and hope in my heart, become the place where I experience love and joy. Mm-hmm. It's just the nature of this world that God breathed into existence.
This is, you touch on this a lot in your book, This Too Shall Last. So I would love to move, that has been on my radar. That book has been on my radar for a while. I started reading the Book of Common Courage and maybe got 2 or 3 pages in and immediately ordered This Too Shall Last. So I've been reading them both at the same time. But yes, I mean, it's so beautiful the way that you bring Christ's life, Christ's work, Christ's suffering into the moment and the living out of our own suffering. I'm like thinking, where was I going with this?
Yeah. And I just want to say also, just to interject, my older daughter has undiagnosed chronic illness. So she's just in chronic pain, primarily in her head, but also inflammation throughout her body since she was 11, and she's 27 now. And I got This Too Shall Last. I actually got that book first, and I bought myself a copy and one for my daughter, like just preemptively. I'm like, she'll love it, because, but yeah, it has been so helpful for me. I mean, obviously, even though I don't have a chronic illness other than anxiety. I do have chronic anxiety, but it's been helpful for me to look at it through your eyes. And some of the things that you say in the book are almost verbatim conversations that I've had with my daughter. Mm-hmm. And I just, your willingness to be so transparent with your story is such a gift to me as the mother of my suffering daughter. And then because I don't want to, I said, I have chronic anxieties, if that's not a big deal. It's a big deal.
It is a big deal.
So it's helpful to me for my own story, but also in being able to see my daughter's story with clearer eyes, even though I've walked through it with her.
Yeah.
It's been helpful.
Well, and, as you were talking about experiencing love in those moments, that's something that was hard for me to express, as well as how love came and inhabited those moments of suffering. It's hard. We don't have words. I don't have words, and I'm a word person. The closest that I could get was surrender, a feeling of surrender. When you can't get out of that pain and there's nothing else. And so do you think that, I'm struggling to express this. Do you think that's because, is that like a uniquely Western English speaking
deficiency
that we don't have words to talk about being in suffering and even finding joy in suffering. It's so antithetical that we can't even like have a conversation about it almost.
Well, I think
it's just me.
No, I think maybe part of it is our culture and a lack of language, a lack of practice. But I think part of it is that we're butting up against an incredibly mystical reality. Like, there aren't actually words for the like ineffable nature of communion with God in that place. It is beyond words. So I think, sometimes the holiest things, those moments that we're talking about are akin to the concept, like the Celtic concept of being in a thin place. I really think that like there's a similar reality happening that to like as you're in a stunning place, bearing witness to beauty, that you feel this closeness to the divine. It's like light and joy pierce through the air, and they come right into your skin and into your spirit. I think that there's a very similar experience happening that we're getting at in the midst of pain, in the midst of loss and hard things, that our bodies actually become a thin place as we like dare to pay attention to our own pain and our own sensations as full, already permeated by the presence of God. Joy permeates us, and I really do think that there's a participation almost in like a different kind of time and space that happens. The concept of like Chronos time and Kairos time, that like often we're in this Chronos regular sense of time where time is scarce, time is fleeting, and there's something about pain and suffering that it disrupts your experience of time, and that's something that trauma does too, which I find this is part of why I think trauma is can be the site of our trauma can become the place of our transformation, because the disruption of time actually is both a major loss and like has awful consequences, and like having time disrupted can be you're able to connect to this more abundant sense of time and this more abundant sense of presence that's right here. And I mean, I'll tell you, even down to the writing of the Book of Common Courage, I was so sick during most of writing this, but especially the second half of writing it. And when my book arrived, like first copy of this hardcover book arrived, I thought to myself, I don't know how this got written. Like, and I am not exaggerating. I don't actually know, like, looking back over when I sat down to work on this, somehow it all became a book. It's like there was more time in that process than is actually on the clock. Like my efforts got multiplied somehow in the midst of showing up and consenting to be present in my actual life. And somehow that was more than enough to fill the pages of this book. And there's a real book here. We're talking about like very mysterious realities, but to break it down for people listening, is that like our pain of all kinds can actually be a portal into the presence of God that already is within us. and is in every person that we see, and paying attention gives us the invitation to participate in it.
I love that you brought up thin places. We did a podcast a few months ago about thin places. That's one of my favorite things to talk about. But I had never thought of the concept of a thin place being within our bodies.
Yes.
And that is just like, earth shattering and so true. And it is what I'm struggling to describe.
Yeah.
It's a thin place. It's an experience that you just cannot account for without the mystical. Mm-hmm. So thank you for connecting that for me.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
And I see that as you were describing that, I can see I have two daughters, but the one that I mentioned who's chronically ill, she has I don't know how to describe the way her faith just looks different to me. And people have commented on that. People who meet her, there's a depth to her. And there has been, even when she was a teenager. So there's and it's because I think when you have chronic pain, like you were saying, that you have to pay attention. There's no way to not pay attention to that. It's just sort of how you're paying attention. And I am really grateful to Jesus for his tenderness with her, that she has accepted the invitation over her years of her difficult life to listen to him and not to shut him off when she's paying attention to her pain. She just has a beautiful relationship with Jesus that I have been learning from since she was a preteen. But she gets really frustrated with, it's one of those things where it can be difficult for her to ask for prayer, particularly on like social media, because, and I'm sure you know this, you get the responses from the people, the "have you tried"
yes
answers. And I know people mean well, but it can be so frustrating. It's almost like a rejection of what she's actually trying to express. She wants people to just enter into her pain and love her. But there are the people who, what they're saying, "have you tried," is something they're selling. There are those people, and that's different. But even the ones who do mean well, like, "Oh, have you tried going gluten-free? Have you tried going vegan? Have you tried this?" And I get frustrated as her mom, because I just feel like there's such a rejection of chronic suffering.
Yeah. Here's my personal rule. If you're not in my everyday embodied life and a trusted friend, you aren't allowed to ask me if I've tried something unless you are willing to pay for it for me.
Oh, there you go.
That's my rule. Because
that's a good rule.
And the point, aside from it being funny, is that almost everybody, is willing to engage in the cheap love of offering up suggestions, but who is willing to engage in the costly love of changing the systems, including economic systems of continuing to have people be sick? Sure, there's a lot of alternative treatments and things that would be helpful for people like me, but if it's my individual family's sole responsibility to be able to access those things, then I am too limited to be able to do every single kind of alternative thing that might be great for my body. So I say, church, are you willing to be part of that with me? Right. Are you willing to share your resources so that I can access that kind of care? And in general, people aren't going to be willing to do that. I think we don't in general. We don't remember the fact of how interdependent we are. And we place the responsibility of wellness on individuals when wellness is actually only possible communally. And when we hold responsibility for each other. And this particular little place of that every chronically ill person experiences commentary on what would make us better is actually gives us a little microscope or magnifying glass into the fact that this is a systemic issue. And we need, if you want to offer up suggestions, then you have to be part of making those suggestions accessible.
Right.
Well, and I think with the suggestions, perhaps unintentionally comes an amount of shame.
Oh, for sure.
You have done this or not done this, and that is why you have this suffering, which, anybody who's had any amount of, suffering, especially physical.
You don't need that added.
No, you don't need that. No, I don't need that added.
It's not helpful.
And sometimes you don't want, and I think if you from my perspective or from Emmy, my daughter's perspective, when we make people feel like we're rejecting their suggestions, there's almost, you can sort of feel the tension of well, I guess, you just want to not feel good. There's almost a pushback, and it's frustrating to feel like Emmy's commitment to feeling, she really is committed to not feeling like this anymore. If that were possible, that would be great. It's not like she doesn't, it's not like she's enjoying her chronically ill situation. And so I feel like it was occurring to me, I'm like, it's like the chronically well cannot and kind of don't want to sometimes, or it feels that way. They don't enter into the space of the chronically ill, and they're unwilling to be like, wow, you really might be in pain for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And let me just be quiet and sit with that sadness. No, they don't want to do that.
No, because I think people like your daughter and people like me are reminders of our mortality to everybody else. And no one wants to be reminded of the fact that they are going to die. No one wants to be reminded of the fact that they're aging too, and that their body is going to progressively lose function too. Just because mine is happening in a younger body than it should. I am a reminder to others of their own coming death. And every time that someone interacts with me, and my experience of pain or my experience of a medical crisis, a life-threatening event, the fact that I need ongoing, large amounts of treatment is a reminder to them of their own fragility and their own lack of control over what will happen in their life. And no one wants to be reminded of the fact that horrible things can and will happen to them. This is, and actually it's anxiety management. People's responses to us is often less about loving us and more about managing their own anxiety. And if they could listen, they could actually see people like your daughter are beacons of the fact that we belong, even if we're broken, that perseverance is possible in the middle of horrible things. She's not a problem to fix. She's a person to witness the beauty of the fact that she goes on, that she shows up in her life, even in pain. And far too few people can get past their own anxiety to see that.
Yeah. There's room, I think, the church makes room for miracles, which we do not see in the same sense that that was present in Jesus, when Jesus walked the earth. And there's room for personal striving. But there's just not room for communal suffering, for coming alongside, except for when there is, except for, those people who just show up at your door.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now we're all crying. Okay. Yeah. Are you?
You're like, are you okay?
I know. I want Evangeline to get to ask her next question. Are you okay?
No, I'm okay. I was just saying that I do want to say that there are people who get it right and who, just come alongside you, and they become so precious.
I totally agree. Mm-hmm. Yep. I have those people too.
Yeah. So thankful. And it does make you see, what is lacking and what could be. And you just want to say, to the people who, say, well, we're praying that it's gone, that it, like with the next scan, my youngest, and this is not something that I've talked about much on the podcast, my youngest has a mass in the cerebellum. And so, they say, well, we're praying that with the next MRI, it will be gone. And we're like, that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. But then, there's other people who just come alongside you, show up at your door, send you dinner, when you get back from a long day at Children's Hospital, there's dinner, and so it's those people who are walking with you, allowing the suffering and allowing you to be embodied, which is such a gift. It's such a gift. And that's something that you talk about a lot in This Too Shall Last, which is so meaningful and so needed. In the American church right now, I think that there's so much scorn for the body. I grew up evangelical, and it was, the emphasis is always on the soul, the spirit, and everything of the flesh is evil. Right. And it's so damaging, and it's so wrong.
It keeps you from being able to actually experience that thin place, because you think that thin place is actually evil.
Yes.
And it could not be more opposite.
Yeah. I love when you talk about that in This Too Shall Last. I love, this is a little bit sideways from where you were going, so I love on This Too Shall Last how you invite us to sit on the couch and grab a blanket, and it really does feel that way. The way you write it, I just want to affirm for you that I feel like you're sitting with me on the couch. I really do, and it's the coming alongside. And the fact that God has given you that gift of coming alongside, even with readers that you're not in the room with, the fact that He has given you the gift to make it feel that way is really a blessing. Blessing is a puny little word to describe what it is, but it's a gift to me.
I'm so grateful that it feels that way.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's like, that's the hope. And I don't totally understand. I think it gets back to the same kind of feeling of getting to experience divine love, even in the middle of my own distress. It feels like that. I don't totally understand how it's possible that people feel a presence of love in that way in my books. And I feel just this like strange gratitude that I don't think I could manufacture that. I think that I'm just getting to participate in something of the Spirit being present in a way that pervades time and space, and like,
it's like we're in the same thin space together.
Yeah, I'm just really grateful. I don't know why or exactly how that gets to happen, and I'm grateful that it does. That like books get to reach places that I wouldn't be able to be physically present with people. And I'll just never stop marveling at that gift that like books can be a companion in the places that other people can't sit with you. The places where you are having to like experience this thing on your own, in bed, at the infusion center, in the middle, like while you're in the waiting room for something. Like there's just places that other people can't always go with you, but sometimes a book can sit with you. And I just feel like super privileged and honored to get to put some of those out there, some books like that out there that get to be a companion to people.
Yeah.
Well, I want everybody like to be able to have that experience. I want everyone to be able to sit on the couch with you. So tell our readers, our listeners. Yeah, listeners, your readers, where they can find you online. We've talked about your books, but just give us some touch points for where people can encounter you so that they can also encounter healing and just the exhalation of breath.
I don't always like run through the 3 books, but for some reason I'm feeling the need to. Just for those listening who are like, I don't really know where to start with. If you're wanting to read one of my books, I think if you're feeling overwhelmed and if it's been really hard to read lately, the Book of Common Courage is a great place to start because it's very like accessible. It's very much more like you do not have to read it cover to cover. You can just open it up and read like one prayer or one poem at a time. So that is,
I just recommended it to my friend the other day who specifically was saying she can't read right now.
Yeah. And I'm finding that's like where so many people are at. I hear that from so many readers. So I'm really grateful to be able to offer something that's like, this is accessible, even if you haven't read a book in 2 years because your brain can't take it. Like you might be able to read this. All of my books I narrated myself, so you can listen to the audio as well, which is helpful if you're just like struggling with reading. I love audiobooks, and so personally, I know I'm going further and I'm giving you something else than you asked for, but one of my little like favorite nerdy things to do. I love to I'll treat myself and listen to the audio of a book while reading the actual paperback or hardcover. And that just gives your brain this really beautiful experience of co-regulation, of hearing a person's voice while reading. And I just want to encourage folks that if you're struggling to be able to, with processing stuff, that could be a helpful way to help your brain along. So that's a side note. But the other 2, This Too Shall Last was my first book. And that one I talk a lot more focused in on my physical experience of pain and a theology of suffering. And then the second book that sandwiched between those 2 is The Lord Is My Courage. And that one I talk a lot about my experience of spiritual abuse and religious trauma, but really it's also an invitation into being able to be present in your life in a story you didn't ask for. And there's different insights in there about the way that trauma affects your body and the way that you can regulate your own nervous system, along with lots of insights about Psalm 23 and Jesus as our good shepherd. So even if you haven't experienced what you might call religious trauma or spiritual abuse, I think that it might help you see some of the pain in your life differently. So those are the 3 books, and you can find all of it at kjramsey.com. And then I'm on social media, especially Instagram, at KJ Ramsey Writes. So, and I have a Substack too, people can subscribe to, but it's all on my website, including the social media links.
Excellent.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been blessing again.
Huge, yes.
I need a better word.
Huge. Well, that's because we don't have enough words.
We don't have
there
enough
are
words.
never enough words.
No.
Yes, but we are so thankful. And yes, I would encourage our listeners, go to Instagram and find KJ Ramsey immediately.
Yeah. Forthwith.
Yes, forthwith.
Yes.
Well, thank you. And thank you both for sharing little bits of your family's stories too. It's really beautiful to hear.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Things are winding down at the Anselm Society Digital Pub. The fire is down to embers, the customers are trundling home, and you've polished off your final glass. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. If you have a minute or so to spare, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time.